Hello and welcome to Rewildology, the show that explores conservation, travel, and rewilding the planet. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell-Norman, conservation biologist and adventure traveler. February was such a fun month sharing our Women in Conservation Science series. We sat down with three incredible women conservation scientists from around the world and ended this series with a compilation of advice from 12 of the show's former guests. If you missed an episode and would like to hear a little snippet before diving into the full thing, check out these highlights to see if you might want to go back and listen to the full episode in its entirety. All right, let's dive in. For the first episode in our Women in Conservation Science series, we met Hiral Naik, African Program Manager for Save the Snakes and a PhD student at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So how do you exactly study animals that are really good at not being seen or found or giving you any sign that they're there? Like, how do you actually study snakes from someone who has no clue?
That's a very good question. You have to find the hotspots. So, I mean, typically we've had experts in the field for a really long time. So every student coming in will find a field site that is quite popular for certain snake species. Obviously different regions, you find different snake species which are quite dominant. And so it rather becomes more about the question that you're trying to ask as a scientist. What are you trying to figure out about the species? Are you trying to figure out the movement behavior of certain species? To give you an example, my professor that really kind of inspired a lot of my interest in snakes and snake biology and evolution really became interested in the movement of puff adders, which are these fat little thick snakes that you find here in South Africa and most of other parts of Africa as well. But we're quite interested in, learning more about how such a slow-moving ambush foraging snake moves from place to place, how long it takes them to move. So that requires, different methodologies. So first of all, how are we going to track the snake? Well, we need transmitters, and the transmitters then need to be implanted in the snake. And then you have to track the snake. So it takes a huge chunk of time for the researcher themselves to track a snake every day to ensure that they can still keep track of the snake, because otherwise you're likely to lose the placement of the snake. It might be okay when you're tracking something like a slow-moving puff adder, but if you're tracking something like a fast-moving cobra, they can move large distances. So that's one example. The other example is some of the work that I'm doing with behavior. So with behavior, it's largely observational. Again, it just means that, you need the necessary ethical clearance and research permits to access snakes in the wild. And then if you have a facility like Pittsburgh Reptile Center, you can bring them here, you can house them and create certain rooms or arenas or whatever kind of observational area that is required for whatever topic you're looking at. And then you kind of set it up that way. So there's a lot of things that go into thinking about how you're going to work with snakes. They're like pretty much other animals when it comes to getting the right research permits, getting the right ethical clearances. But I will say that, when it comes to reptiles specifically, even from the research side, there isn't really a lot of interest, and there hasn't been as much of an interest. Obviously, when you're like me and you live in a country where mammals kind of take the preference in so many ways.
That's pretty universal. I think pretty much everywhere mammals definitely win out over the herps, which is unfortunate. I mean, my big love happens to be a mammal, but we need to know and understand all of our species if we're going to properly save our biodiversity. Yeah, because I've just wondered about that. snakes don't have necks, so you can't put a collar on it. They don't have legs, so you can't put an ankle bracelet around it. They slither in things, so you can't put a tag on it. So I'm like, how in the world do you actually study snakes to understand their biology and and what they do, really, like what they do on a daily basis? Because it just seems that when we hear about snakes, it's not usually in a good way. You know, someone happens to stumble upon one because they're running, because, you know, in Colorado, you know, that's a really big thing with rattlesnakes, that runners might go out or dogs get taken quite often. So it's not really good that we hear good things about them when they're just living their life. They're not intentionally doing anything. So with that, though, that brings up the next really important question, and that is their conservation. So how are our snakes doing, maybe on a global scale? So overall, what's the trend happening with snakes? And then maybe let's also then zoom in on South Africa and maybe some of the species that you work with, and what are they experiencing, and how are they faring?
Yeah, sure. So just a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was a huge paper that came out that actually showed there's a massive decline happening in a lot of our world's reptiles. We know snakes to be quite resilient, and they are. There are a fair number of threatened species around the world, also because a lot of snakes are quite endemic to certain locations. So if they only occur on one island in the South Pacific or something, then they're immediately classed as threatened, and you have to try and figure out, is there some kind of decline? Are they threatened because the island is being deforested, or there's some kind of external environmental threat? On the whole, snakes are okay. Like I said, they are quite resilient. But the biggest challenge with snakes is that we actually don't know what's happening. So snakes are one of the most understudied species in the world. And as much as I mentioned that the fact that you can put a tracker in some snakes, they have to be big enough. And most snakes are actually like really, really tiny and super thin, which means that we have no way to really track what they're doing, how they're behaving, and what kind of threats they're facing. There's a lot of threats that are facing other species, like habitat transformation, urban development, just natural habitat loss, and human wildlife conflict are all affecting snakes as well. But we really have no idea the impact that they're having on the population numbers, because population numbers are not easy, or population studies are not necessarily that easy to be done. And so, when it comes down to South Africa specifically, we also, most of our snakes are classed as least concern by the IUCN. But the truth is, there are these small little pockets that are experiencing massive transformation. People that we speak to that have lived in a location will tell us that, even snake numbers are not what they used to be about 10 years ago. So the truth is that there is a decline happening. Whether that means that we need to start caring about it right now or in the future is up to us. And so someone like myself, as a snake conservationist, it's my duty to kind of prioritize that and say, okay, well, maybe they're not declining right now. But what happens when all the rhinos and elephants and giraffes of the world are gone? What species are we going to then, be looking after? And even if snakes are around then, we don't really know what numbers they're going to be around in. And so it means that we have to stop looking at it from a species-specific point of view and start protecting biodiversity as a whole.
Next, we sat down with Coral Wolf, Conservation Science Program Manager at Island Conservation. So, obviously, restoring islands has fantastic and amazing benefits to the island ecosystem itself. We can see these remove these rats, and all of a sudden nesting birds are coming back, and on and on. And so many examples that I'm sure you can give. But our conversation is the next level of this. And so could you maybe give us some information on how exactly is our islands and seas connected? And how does restoring islands then benefit the surrounding sea?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, my background, what I didn't say at the beginning, I'm a terrestrial biologist. So all of my exposure up until recently has been on the islands, not around them, despite my name. So
I love your name. I love your name so much.
So, we as researchers, we have this tunnel vision sometimes, right? And I think what was appealing to me about research on islands was that there were boundaries. I could pick a place and really get to know it. And those were artificial. And so I think that's really what we're learning, and what's been really cool about the research that's been coming out in really the last 10 years or so, is that these specialties, are these artificial silos we create as a terrestrial biologist aren't, we need to be looking outside of those. So maybe one example to give you kind of where I came from when I was learning about these connections with the marine environment. A project I was involved in was on Palmyra Atoll, and it's an atoll 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. And our organization, along with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy, worked on a rat eradication project there to help protect some of the terrestrial biodiversity. That was the original stated goal. And so we collected, baseline data there, looking at how, what does the vegetation look like before the rat eradication, for example. And this was a place that it was, we have photos, hopefully we can share with you, but it's just amazing. The native forest, we went back just 1 month after the rat eradication. And, one of these plots just had a carpet of seedlings. And it was just, go back to the lab and look at the pre-eradication data. There wasn't anything like that. We weren't seeing, we had assumed that the rats had been eating the seeds and the seedlings, but really hadn't, you don't know, exactly how much of an impact they're having until you see that release, right, from their predation. And, went back a year later, and those seedlings are growing, and this native forest is now able to regenerate on its own. And it was just really impactful for me. And we were seeing, the same thing with other species within that native forest. The coconut crabs, those populations do better in that native forest. The arthropod diversity is higher. Seabird nesting, that's where that forest is providing seabird nesting habitat. And so, you start seeing all these connections within the terrestrial environment. And around that same time, because there's marine researchers there at Palmyra Atoll as well, Doug McCulley, who's now at UC Santa Barbara, he came out with a paper looking at some of the marine metrics. And one thing he found and his team was that manta ray abundance was much higher around the native forest coastline. And the connection he drew was that the seabird roosting and nesting in these native forests, in the native trees, was helping to fertilize the soil, which helped to increase the coastal nutrients. And then, therefore, the abundance of plankton increased along those coastlines, which attracted manta rays, their food resource being plankton. And so all of a sudden, all these connections were flowing down into the ocean. And it was in contrast to some of this, there's also coconut palm forests on this atoll. So you could really see a distinction between where manta rays were spending more time versus, along the native forest versus the coconut palm forest. And that would it blew my mind. There was all of a sudden all these new areas to explore. And since then, all these other marine researchers have dug into this, the connectivity between the land and sea.
Yeah, which totally brings up your paper. That's the main topic of today. So let's just start diving in. that literally and figuratively. This paper that you were part of writing, which could be very revolutionary on the way we look at island and marine, restoration moving forward, which is, oh, it's so fantastic and just gets me tingly. Like, what's the future for how we are going to rewild our islands? And so, yeah, could you actually let's just start learning from you and what you all wrote about and discovered. So could you take me, like, what is the name of your paper and maybe what are some of the highlight takeaways? We don't need to go down to like the super nitty gritty, but what is the things that we should know about what you all published in this historic paper?
Sure. So the paper is called Harnessing Island Ocean Connections to Maximize Marine Benefits of Island Conservation. And it was co-led by Stuart Sandin, who's at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, and Penny Becker, who works with me at Island Conservation. And I guess maybe to set the stage, I think one of the things that was really clear early on, and so I should maybe take a step back first and say that, the paper brought together a large group of researchers. So it was experts from a variety of fields representing all different expertises. As I was saying, my background is terrestrial. And so it was starting to think about this holistic approach to islands. And historically, human societies living along the coast understood and managed terrestrial and marine natural resources together. The Hawaiians have a ridge to reef model called the Ahupua'a system. And so we knew, historically, people knew that these systems were linked. And what had happened is, Western researchers, science had begun to catch up and break down these silos. So there had been growing research that linked seabird communities with faster growing reef populations around those islands, increased rates of coral recovery after bleaching events from climate change. Some other research out of New Zealand demonstrated that high seabird densities had higher biodiversity of macroalgae. So there started to be all these connections that researchers were pulling together. And they were all built on these natural experiments where islands with high density of seabirds were compared with those that had low density of seabirds. And what was clear is that the high density of seabird islands also had no invasive predator mammals compared to the low density seabird islands where invasive predator mammals were present. So the purpose of the paper was to expand our understanding of how and when the eradication of invasive mammals could be utilized as a tool just to benefit these ocean conservation and management goals. We have specific examples like the one in New Zealand and some of these other ones that have come out of the Chagos Archipelago and the Indian Ocean. But are there generalities that we can make? What can we learn about these land-sea linkages and where should we be going?
3rd in February, we had an inspirational conversation with Frida Lara, PhD, shark researcher, dive master, and co-founder of Orcas. So that's really cool and the perfect transition to what came next. So I don't want to spoil it. I want you to do it. So you tell me and tell those listening, what's the big thing that came to be after that? And how exactly did all the pieces come together to build what you're currently working on?
Yeah, so in that time, I had this group of friends. Some of them are droners, some of them are managers, lawyers, everything. And they were all related to the ocean. We were good friends, all divers. It came to be that all of us were women in that moment. And we had one night a dinner with some friends. And one of them told us that why not to start an NGO? Because we were all related to the ocean and we were very worried about the conservation of the place. So we're like, yeah, let's do it now. And in that time, this group of women organized themselves and started working with the community.
Okay.
So I remember that was in July. Well, in Mexico, we have a fishing ban that lasts 3 months. So in these 3 months, we are not able to, is not allowed to catch or sell any kind of fish of sharks and rays. So we had this fishing ban for 3 months. And I remember going diving to this famous seamount 2 hours from home and seeing 20 silky sharks every time we were going there, taking photos and doing all that. And it was beautiful, but at the same time, it was sad because we knew that when the fishing ban was over, they will be able to catch them legally. And we're like, no, like we were so like happy and at the same time like desperate because we were like, we know reality. This is totally normal. We don't like it, but we have to do something, no? And the first thing we decided to do was to look for the fishermen camp that currently are catching sharks and talk to them just to see how they are doing, if they need some help, and negotiate with them to know what are the solutions. And this is how we started the NGO. Orcas, that is organization CAS, is a game of the words. It started like that because we had this community. It's called Agua Amarga. It's a community that is 1 hour south from La Paz. And we are currently working with 10 fishermen that are catching sharks. So the idea was to propose them a way to transition it from shark fishing to other economic activities like nature-based tourism and science. So we have been working with them for over a year and a half. And yes, it's going pretty well. They are super confident now. They really enjoy doing it. We have been able to give them courses for first aid. They take a lot of capacitations about ecology, about sharks. They totally understand why we are doing this. And actually, like now, they are very worried about conserving the area, no? Because they see the potential. They obviously understand that sharks and the nature itself is worth more alive than dead. So now when we see, for example, a trawler in front of their town, they're like, no, like we have to take them out. So yeah, it's totally a different mindset now.
And let's go back to day one, because I think a lot of us that have been in conservation for a while, there's a lot of layers to this. So you amazing ladies decided that this is the community that we want to talk to and we want to approach. Can you take me back to that day or that week or when this whole thing started? Because I imagine, having experience in my own work and sitting down with so many people, most people aren't receptive to strangers coming in and telling them that their way of life is wrong, which I understand too. I come from a very rural place myself. I understand if someone comes to me and be like, I'm sorry that your way of life is not correct. So, I mean, who wants to hear that? So take me back to square one. How exactly did you guys approach this community, and how did you get them on board? Isn't really the right term, but to help them see the value of what they had, and that they didn't just have to fish it, like they could use it in a more sustainable way. So how did that happen? What was day one, and then how did you get them, I guess, on board to this other way of life?
Yeah, so I think starting from not judging them, and this is also related a lot from my previous 2 years of guiding. So I knew a lot of them already because I was using them as captains informally, or they saw me sometimes in the ocean. They knew my face, so I wasn't like coming out of nowhere. They already knew something about me. And also the name of Orcas is also very related to the animal, because in that moment when we start going out and swimming in the nature, it turns out that during the pandemic, it was very easy or often to get to find orcas in the area where they live. And as fishermen, they have been always super scared and afraid about the animal because they have seen them for many years and many times. But there is a thing with the fishermen that the orcas can kill them or they can damage their boats. So every time they saw orcas, they were like running away from it. And then these 12 crazy ladies come and try to, and they say like, don't worry, this is fine. Like they are the best animals. This is the best encounter. Like we love them. And like getting to see these ladies, super talented, like with cameras and drones and everything, to get to swim with this animal, no, that is huge and super impressive. So I think that way we connected with them, and there was like an admiration and surprise kind of relationship. Like these girls are super brave. Like I don't know them, but they are doing something crazy. And yeah, so it started from that, and then also because we were not judging them. We knew that they were doing something that probably could be very bad for the sharks, and they knew that we loved sharks, but we also understand the reality. They are artisanal fishermen. They have been working like that for 5 generations. That's the only way that they have been able to sustain their families, and we had to understand that. If you don't understand that, then it's really difficult to communicate because it's challenging for them. But obviously, if they had another option, they will do it. But they never had it, and they live in a desert in a very, very isolated community. And it's not easy to work in industry or work or grow vegetables. No, it's the desert. There is nothing else. So they have been always related to the ocean, and they rely on it. And they were the ones that were selected to work just on shark fishing. So it's very important to understand the difference between an artisanal fisherman and an industrial fishing, because we always talk fishing in general, but these guys are trying to work in and use very selective techniques, so they create the least impact because they worried about the resources. While they see the industrial fishing boats outside of their town catching what they catch in 1 year, they catch it in 1 night with their huge nets. So it's not comparable. And in Mexico, they are allowed to do it because the Mexican law doesn't really regulate that area. So they just see the impact, and they see the reduction of the species. They see how sharks are not doing pretty well. And that's how like they saw it as an opportunity. If we don't take it now and we don't work with these girls, probably it's going to be too late. And next year, probably we don't have enough money from catching sharks because they see the effect of all this reduction, no? So I think we came just at the right time, and we had the right approach, and we still are learning a lot of things. Like probably through the months and now the years, we are learning how to make it more successful, and they are also like teaching us a lot of things, no? They are true naturalists, and they know all the species, they know how to approach.
Lastly, for our Women in Conservation Science series, we shared a compilation of advice from 12 women scientists on the show. Fifth is Natasha Babik, Eurasian brown bear researcher and PhD candidate at Monash University. Do you have any piece of advice or any like a message or anything that you would love to share with everyone listening from your journey and everything that you've been through, essentially?
Yeah, that's a big one and a hard one, but yeah, I guess you always want to try and give advice. It doesn't sound cliche, but cliches exist for a reason. And that's like, like I was saying earlier, be determined, be reasonable too, right? Because sometimes we set our expectations right up here, and then it can be really hard and disappointing, especially when you're working with a conflict species. Like, let's be honest, there is a lot of heartache involved, but don't let it dishearten you, because you have to keep in mind as a conservationist that, you're doing it for the right reasons. And without people like us, there's just no hope moving forward. There needs to be people like us. And even if you, especially as a PhD student, like the struggle of, some of my people in my cohort, like, all of us, even me sometimes, suffering from like imposter syndrome, like, but I can't be doing a PhD. I can't be, I'm not great yet. And, sometimes there are days even I'm like, wow, I feel like I know nothing. But everything you do, every small little step that you do is contributing to something. And you have to start somewhere, right? What do they say? Waterfalls start with like just a trickle at first. So even when things seem really hopeless, they're really not. They're really, really not. There is always hope as long as you keep trying, right? But yeah, you need to be kind to yourself and look after yourself as well. And that's why, you have good supervisors, try and surround yourself with some good people, and just, don't give up. Don't take no, and just keep the animals in mind, and you can get through it, definitely, because it's hard. It's really hard. Doesn't matter what level you're at. I think if you're doing a PhD, if you're not, if you're, high level researcher, if you're entry level, like everyone has similar experiences, but we're here for the animals and for humans, right? It's important.
Next up, we have Rose Bear Don't Walk, ethnobotanist and PhD student at the University of Montana. I always love to ask this one last question, and it is, and you have already said something similar, but if there's anything else, what advice do you have for anyone listening? Or like, what's a last message that if we don't take away anything, we could take away this one thing? What would that be?
That Indigenous people don't have a monopoly on plants, and that everybody can have and cultivate a loving relationship with the plants of their area. But when that relationship comes at the expense of the plants or Indigenous people in an extractive way, it takes away from that relationship and that intention. So basically is you can go out in your landscape and you can have a fundamentally loving, reciprocal, gracious relationship with plants, as Indigenous peoples have had for thousands of years. But once you start commodifying, and once you start treating a plant as a commodity or something to capitalize on or anything like that, that is when the plants will turn away from you, from us. So don't go buy sage from Urban Outfitters because it was probably not picked by an Indigenous person, or it was picked in a way that probably damaged or destroyed the plant. And also you're paying $25 for it, which is like just gross to me. like trying to find ways to have that relationship with that plant in a more intimate and loving way, whether that's, getting your sage from an Indigenous person who actually goes out and knows how to, forage these in good and ethical ways, or maybe like finding a way to pick it to yourself or anything like that. I think just in the world of ecosystem management and the environment is that once we come to the point of extraction and commodification and capitalism, things start to go downhill.
7th is DRN Smith, DVM, wildlife veterinarian and the world's leading pygmy sloth researcher. If there is a message or a piece of advice or anything that you would love to give or say to everyone listening, what might that be?
Well, I think that the most important thing is that we have to realize that we are living in the same place. All the human beings and all the living beings are in the same home. So we have to empathize with them too, even if it's a small animal. I mean, we always be more in contact with huge, big cats, like, because they are powerful. But there are other part of the species that need to be protected too. And we need to be aware of the way that we are behaved has a consequence in the future. And we need to start to do our own effort to do the best, trying to preserve what we have now, and to continue enjoy it in the future, to continue enjoying in the future. So that is very important, because probably our daily life is not showing or facing us what is happening in the forest, or because we are living in the city. And if something happened in the Amazonia, or something happened in the, in the Escudo, in the forest of Escudo, it's like that is not going to affect me. Yes, of course. Everything is connected and it's going to affect us in some point. So we just need to be more close to our motherland because it's important for us.
And that is it, a snapshot of February's Women in Conservation Science series. We truly appreciate each and every one of you that followed the podcast series and engaged on our social channels throughout the month of February. We had a blast putting these episodes together and already have plans for a similar but different series in the near future, so stay tuned. As always, we want to thank you for being a part of the Rewildology community. If you have any questions about the episodes in the Women in Conservation Science series, head on over to the Rewildologist Facebook group and submit your questions on the homepage. If you would like to support the show, there are several options to do so. Some zero-cost ways include subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming app, leaving a rating and review to boost the algorithm, which will present the podcast to more listeners, signing up for the weekly Rewildology newsletter at rewildology.com, subscribing to the YouTube channel, and following the show on your favorite social media app. If you'd like to financially support the show and help us keep these stories on the airwaves, consider making a monetary donation at rewildology.com or purchase a piece of swag to show off your Rewildology love. At least 10% of proceeds from this podcast will be donated to our conservation partners. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Heather Valley, the show's audio and video producer, and Focusrite for powering the podcast sound. If you'd like to see the Focusrite gear we use to record the show, head on over to rewildology.com and check out Nature Podcasting under the Resources tab. Until next time, friends, together we will rewild the planet. Hey, thanks again for listening to this episode of Rewildology. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button to never miss a future episode. Do you have a cool environmental organization, travel story, or research that you'd like to share? Let me know at rewildology.com. Until next time, friends, together we will rewild the planet.